Okay, well here's my video response for the is Dana White good for MMA? And doing it just because I'm a little bit bored at the moment, and I don't really want to go to bed because I don't have to get up tomorrow, so I want to sleep now. Which may seem weird, but anyways, here's the thoughts on it. It's a loaded question as to what do you think of it needs to happen for MMA. And basically the key is, do you look at what he does well for the UFC, or what does he do well for MMA as a whole? I think he does very little for MMA as a whole, to be quite honest, because he badmouths every other promotion, which I know is a promotional tactic, and that's good for the UFC, but it's not good for the MMA awareness, for the developing of knowledge amongst fans, for fighter payroll, and a competitive work environment for the fighters. Because let's face it, you're looking at the UFC taking in millions of dollars between pay-per-view revenue and the gate per pay-per-view event, and probably actually still a fair amount for a fight night, pardon me. And you still have some fighters who show up and make $2,000 a fight, which will not always cover their medical expenses, although there are rumors that the UFC does sort of, help with that as well. So I can't complain about that, but still, $2,000. And people say that, compared to other professional athletes, they don't have to engage as much. Basically they have to play, 4 or 5 games a year, I suppose is what some would say, comparing it to a team sport. But they have to train constantly, and that's out of pocket, something that it isn't for an NFL player. A lot of the time they have this team sports facilities, or an NHL player. And additionally, $2,000 for 5 fights only equals $10,000, which is still substantially lower than what an NFL player makes for his 5 games. So that's, in my opinion, an invalid argument. I honestly can't think of something good Dana White has done in recent times for MMA as a whole. The popularity of the UFC is a good thing, and he's helped build that. But I think at this point, he's starting to abuse that fact, like he treats the media very poorly, which I think is a bad thing for the sport, because you want media coverage. You don't want media that's just going to bash the sport, but you can't expect everything to be a positive thing. You have to basically be permitted, allow either not to be called on your bullshit by not having any, or being called on it when you're spewing the bullshit. And Dana White hates that idea because he does a lot of bullshit. Talis is a legitimate contender. There's one thing. We will get teammate to fight teammate is another thing, because that's a horrible idea. Every time it's happened, you haven't gotten a very good fight, for one thing. You don't get, you can't think of a crowd pleaser that was teammate versus teammate. There are certain times when this may have been a good idea, i.e. The 2005 Pride Middleweight GP had Vanderlei Silva beaten Ricardo Arona, they would have fought Shogun. That's fair enough in a tournament-style format, because Dana White hates tournaments, so that's an invalid argument when it comes to this particular topic. Another bullshit example, he's finally giving Lyoto Machida a title shot. Yushin Okami still hasn't gotten one. Anderson Silva is the pound-for-pound best fighter, which I don't understand, because he's not even the pound-for-pound best UFC fighter, because when you think about it, he's got more losses than a guy like GSP, or hell, Frank Mir. More losses than Rashad Evans, more losses than a BJ Penn. Although, Frank Mir definitely, I don't think, bears any pound-for-pound reference towards, talking about the pound-for-pound best fighter. But at the same time, if you're going to promote a pound-for-pound best fighter that's not Fedor, who I think most hardcore fans would agree with me is the man, but is, of course, since he cut off talks with the UFC, banned from being talked about on UFC air, I don't know why you go with Anderson Silva, because it's been, he's had lackluster competition. Outside of Rich Franklin, what well-renowned fighters has he fought in the UFC that are on top of the game? Oh, pardon me, Dan Henderson, but Dan Henderson's a reputation that's going down. Nate Marquardt could be argued, but at the same time, that was an ugly looking Nate Marquardt. You knew he wasn't at 100%. That was just a bad card for the Jackson camp in general, because of course Rashad Evans was on that card and basically stunk it up with Tito Ortiz. Although it was a draw fight. Arguably, had the fence not been grabbed, he would have won. But that's a declining Tito, which is another topic. Is of course the bad mouthing, utter bashing of Tito Ortiz, Bob Sobral, and anyone else who leaves the UFC. So I don't see how, since making the UFC somewhat big, which was more the Fertitas throwing money behind it, let's face it, without money, Dana White doesn't do anything. I don't see what he's done well for MMA as a whole. He does a lot of good things for the UFC. Its skyrocketing profits are an example of this. It's status of, you don't hear people going, I'm going to go watch MMA or mixed martial arts. You hear, I'm going to watch Ultimate Fighting. I'm going to watch the UFC, you know. So he's done a lot of good things for the UFC, but he's done a lot of terrible things for MMA. Point said. That's all I have to say.